Engage your brain and enter the mind's eye. I'm DJ BJ Turnov, humble host of this auditorium of audacity on Z-Talk Radio and Stitcher Radio. Happy New Year's, everybody. Hoping that the last 525,600 minutes were phenomenal for you and wishing that your next set will be that much better. If you're anything like me at this time of the year, when the calendar turns, you're definitely taking a look back at past events and at the same time looking forward to the future and new beginnings. And sometimes doing so, looking at the past, you come up with a completely different view about yourself and your own history. On this edition, we're going to do the same thing, but apply it to the great American origin story. Think of it as a new interpretation of the new world for the new year. We Americans, and I say we because I am from the great state of New York. What's up? But we Americans, we love our creation myth. The story of the Pilgrims fleeing religious persecution, surviving an epic journey across the ocean, only to land in the New England wilderness where hard work built what would become our fabled city on the hill. By loving that story, we Americans, we refuse the earlier Jamestown colony as our origin story. We look at it as a cautionary tale of lazy louts who hunted gold until they starved, where they had to be rescued by English food and the hard discipline of martial law. Based on a recent reexamination of historical records, Joseph Kelly, professor of literature at the College of Charleston, says neither stories are entirely true. On this episode, and from his recent book, Marooned, Jamestown, Shipwreck, and a New History of America's Origin, Professor Kelly is going to make the case for replacing Plymouth Rock with Jamestown as America's founding myth. Joseph is going to argue a radically different interpretation, that the Jamestown colonists were literally and figuratively marooned, cut loose from civilization, and cast into the wild. On their way, 10 years before the Mayflower Compact, decades before Hobbes and Locke, and 150 years before Jefferson, these frontiersmen and frontierswomen invented the idea of government by the people, for the people. They also discovered a simple truth, that all are created equal. But on their way to discovering this, it's a tale of shipwrecks, of mutiny, of intrigue, betrayal, redemption, and of freedom in America's earliest settlements. We'll be right back with Professor Joseph Kelly on The Mind's Eye. Thank you for listening to The Mind's Eye on Z-Talk Radio and Stitcher Radio. That's right, we're now on Stitcher Radio, and I'm very humbled to do so because it is one of my favorite platforms for podcasts. Pretty much all my favorite are on it, and I'm really excited for you to be able to listen to us on that platform too. You can listen online, but I would definitely download the app because it's really easy to use and search for other podcasts. And while you're searching on the Stitcher Radio app, make The Mind's Eye one of your favorites, and you'll get all of our episodes for free. Triple thanks to everybody who's done that already and has already subscribed to our YouTube page or our social media sites, Facebook, Twitter. The account is at Mind's Eye Show for both. If you have been perusing our Facebook and Twitter page at Mind's Eye Show, you've been reading our great news articles on other historical topics like tonight that re-examine events from a different light. One such article is about the Titanic, which is a story that's still evolving even after 100 years. New information recently came out that takes a look at an old picture that may prove that this unsinkable ship was actually on fire for days, if not a week or more, before the tragic event of hitting the iceberg. You can read and view all these aforementioned fun stuff under one roof just to make your life easy. Is themindseyemedia.com. Again, themindseyemedia.com. Go to it now so you can prepare yourself for tonight's episode, our bloody reinvention of America's creation story. Back in a mind's eye moment with Professor Joseph Kelly talking about his book, Marooned, Jamestown, Shipwreck, and a New History of America's Origin. This is The Mind's Eye. We're back on The Mind's Eye. Let me introduce our guest, Professor Joseph Kelly, professor of literature at the College of Charleston and also the #1 fan of Charleston, South Carolina. Professor, thank you so much for coming on The Mind's Eye.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. After reading your book, Marooned, Jamestown, Shipwreck, and A New History of America's Origin, one thing that I think we have in common, I have a feeling that me and you both have a big love for Howard Zinn. You a big fan?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, an inspiration.
And I felt like that was like a big part of the book was that, bringing voice to the voiceless. There was a lot of people I never even heard of that had a big hand in American history. And I felt like that was maybe a big point of the book.
Yeah, and I mentioned him very briefly, I think, in the introduction. But really, his work, James Loewen's work, that kind of telling the story of American history from the point of view of the people who don't generally record the history or write the narratives. That I think it's a really important thing to do, and especially in this case, I think it is.
And I think that's a really big idea in education right now is where do we teach education from the standpoint? Do we teach it from a multiculturalist point of view, or do we teach it, from I guess how we look at it is like, how do we teach education from who has ownership of it? Do we look at it from the founder's point of view, or do we look at it from a multiculturalist point of view where everybody had perspective on it? And I feel like in elementary upwards until high school, they really kind of teach it from really a founding father's point of view. And then once if you go to college, if you're lucky enough, that's when you start, learning a lot of the multiculturalist point of view. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm not an expert on K through 12. My expertise generally comes from my own experience and my children's experience. My own is ancient history now. My own kids, I think, was actually, a little more progressive than mine, which is what you would hope. But even so, here in South Carolina, the textbooks tend to be fairly conservative. There's not a great interrogation of the economics of slavery, for instance, and that kind of thing. Although no longer are, slave traders touted as heroes, things like that, which they would have been in my own generation, right? But what's really surprising to me is, you would think that as you get into higher education, exactly what you are suggesting would happen, that you would have a more nuanced, more complex view. And I'm not saying it's not, but if you look at, my particular field is literature, even though I kind of turned myself into a historian and write narrative history now. If you look at the anthologies of American literature, they are still dominated by the master narrative of the Pilgrims' Progress, that's the foundation of America. Now, people protest, and that, I've made this argument, and people have pushed back, and I think correctly that there are other voices included. But if you look at the opening sections of every major anthology, well, I shouldn't say everybody, the ones that are generally adopted in English curricula in higher ed, there will be, here's something about the, Spanish encounter with the New World. Here's some stuff about Native American mythology. Here's some stuff about the Dutch, et cetera. And they'll even maybe include one or two selections from Jamestown. All of that added up generally does not equal the amount of space that's given to what happened in Massachusetts. So, while there's more inclusion in the curriculum now, it's still, those are, okay, here are the other voices. And once you define something as here are the other voices, your mental psyche is going to go, okay, well, what is a D voice, against which these others are defined. And of course, that D voice is the story that William Bradford gives us about the Mayflower and the Pilgrims.
Why is it that Jamestown is considered to be the redheaded stepchild comparatively to, the Plymouth and the Pilgrims in the America's origin story?
Yeah, well, that we could almost spend our whole hour talking about that, but I'll give some brief, quick gestures in that direction. Because it involves American history. Before the Civil War, there were the southern version of nationalism and the northern version of nationalism, and Pocahontas and John Smith were very tied up in the southern definition of the nation's founding, in bad ways too. I think it was a justification for the aristocracy of Virginia. And the rival was the North. And at that time, before the Civil War, Jamestown was actually in ascendant. Most people would have thought of Jamestown as the founding story of America, and the Civil War is going to reverse that, right? And even after the Civil War, Lincoln's proclamation of the Thanksgiving Day, right? And in the midst of the war in which he's praying for the defeat of the South. So it becomes the nation's origin story becomes the Northern origin story. So it's tied up in those kind of politics. And it takes a while. We didn't even know about Thanksgiving Day until the 1840s, really. So that's a manufactured mid-19th century myth, if you will, right? But it becomes ascendant, in the early 20th century, and right around World War I, and the kind of institutionalization of nationalism in the United States, and the construction of a national canon of literature is central to that. And when English departments define a national canon of literature, it is the canon of literature that comes out of Massachusetts, the narratives that come out of there. And even American studies programs, which are really kind of, tend to be very left-leaning, still promoted the notion that the literature of America, the story of America, begins with what we have with the Puritans up in Massachusetts. It's a New England story. So that's why our anthologies reflect that now. And same thing happened in history as well, so that the most important document, which I do talk about in my book, and I think is important, the most important document in the early story of the formation of American democracy is going to be the Mayflower Compact. Of course, what I'm doing, by the time you get to the end of the book, you see I have a very different interpretation of what the meaning of the Mayflower Compact is. I still think it is that important document, but I interpret it in a very different way than your listeners are going to be used to interpreting that document.
And how that document, the seeds of that were sowed within the story of your book and within Jamestown and many of the people that contributed that we didn't hear about.
Absolutely, yeah. So, and not only different people, but the completely different type of people. We attribute that to a great. Here is a great accomplishment of these real religious fanatics who the Pilgrims are. When in fact, I think that's exactly the wrong interpretation of the document, and its origins really begin with the Jamestown story.
And it is,
and there's from reading the book, there's kind of a smoking gun. There's that people have tended to well, not unintended, they've ignored it for 400 years.
And we're going to jump into all that, and I just think it's kind of ironic that the Puritans and Plymouth are considered our origin story when really what's ironic is that they hated democracy on some level and definitely didn't like freedom of religion.
Oh my God. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We, everybody knows. It's not like I'm the first one to say this. I mean, that this is the kind of thing Howard Zinn and James Lowen point out, as well as many others, right? I mean, it's a little odd that we pick these people as the champions of freedom of religion, because what they wanted to do was to escape England so they could enforce a really unfree society, which they did, and they succeeded in doing it. And they sent into exile people who did not believe the same way they believed about the supernatural, about God, about theology. So it's very ironic. I mean, but it's been pointed out for a long time.
Well, I just wanted to point it out one more time.
Yeah. Yes. No, well, obviously you can't point it out enough, because there's still, we still have the great image of the United States as the shining city on a hill, ever since 1960s. John Kennedy is the one that introduced that image that comes out of Puritan New England, introduced it into modern American political lexicon, and as everybody knows, who's over the age of 40, I guess, maybe it's over. I don't know how old you have to be now to remember Ronald Reagan giving those speeches, but he's the one who certainly popularizes it, and it's still with us today, right? The United States is a shining city on the hill, and the virtues that tend to be associated with that image in the political rhetoric are almost diametrically opposed to the virtues that are espoused by the Puritans and the Pilgrims. This myth has a pretty good staying power. But an important thing for people to remember is that this myth has not been with us forever. This myth is about 100 years old. It's been the established dominant myth for just a little over 100 years. So it's not like that these things never change. 50 years from now, people might think about the origins of the United States very, very differently than we do today. And that's what I'm hoping to help accomplish with this book.
Yeah, and I think that's the big part of the book, is that you contend that Jamestown really should be the national identity, the U.S., the U.S.'s origin story. You feel that it's a better representative of our values. Why do you say that?
I think that because it is the experiment of democracy. This is where we see democracy being established for the first time, people espousing doctrines of democracy that we hold, that we consider to be our natural rights and the rights of everybody on the planet, basically, is what we tend to think as Americans, right? People still, first start, I don't want to say toying with that idea because it's not the right word, experimenting with that idea. So they develop it and they start trying to live their lives according to those ideals. Now, it doesn't go real well at the start. They're foiled in those attempts. But we haven't before now recognized what they were doing. And the people I'm talking about are, for the most part, the common settlers and people who tend to have been represented in not only in the early narratives that were dictated by the executives of the Virginia Company. So this is the story getting told to us and recorded by the CEOs and the CFOs and the corporate officers of this, what is, a corporation in the sense that we think of corporations today, a joint stock company. The narratives have come to us from them, and we haven't heard the story from the point of view of the commoners, who are almost always cast into the role of villain in these stories, because they are unruly. These are people who get to Jamestown. They're too lazy to throw a net in the water in order to catch fish to eat. They would rather starve than plant some corn seeds and tend a field. That's not true. It's absolutely, that's how the story has been told to us. And historians, even when they have challenged the credibility of the narratives on other reasons, they know that John Smith was fighting with President Wingfield, and they know Ratcliffe was fighting with Percy. We know all the infighting among those executives, and we discount or at least get suspicious of their narratives because of their own political axe to grind. But nobody really questions the notion of how the commoners were characterized. Most specifically, early on, the first couple of years of Jamestown, they're defecting to Native American villages and districts in droves. And this is always described in the narratives as treasonous, and worse than treasonous. It's a betrayal of the Christian religion. From the point of view of the Virginia Company, they're throwing their lot in with devil worshippers, which is, it's unthinkable that they could be doing such a thing. When in reality, what they're doing is taking charge and responsibility for their own lives. They are claiming the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So they don't use that exact language yet. They get kind of close to it, though. But that's what they're doing. But they've been cast as villains. So the disaster that is Jamestown, and no one can deny it's a disaster. Within a couple of years, they end up eating each other. You can hardly come up with a better symbolic representation of failure than cannibalism, right? But why they get to that point has not been appropriately interpreted in the past, I don't think. So historians, even when they're suspicious of other biases in the narratives, have not done, the kind of Howard Zinn reading of those narratives and discovered, there's a whole nother story to tell here that has not been told before.
And let's unpack everything that you just said, and let's tell that story.
Okay.
Let's go back a little bit. Name of the book: Marooned: Jamestown Shipwreck and a New History of America's Origin. Why Marooned now? Why'd you end up writing it now? And really, what does that mean? Because it's both in your book, it's both metaphor and a reality.
Yeah, the why is not all that meaningful. It's almost kind of I was myself and a colleague here at the College of Charleston named Rich Bodick, who's in the history department, he's another 20th century expert in German history, interwar, and teaches classes in Nazi Germany. But we were fascinated, I don't know, 12, 15 years ago, whenever the TV program Lost was real big and Survivor was real big, and we were thinking, why do we have these? Why are we telling these stories about essentially shipwreck, whether it's a plane wreck or whatever? We're telling stories of people getting cast away and marooned in wildernesses and having to figure out how to survive. So we taught a class on it, and we ended up teaching that class 3 times in 6 years and studying these texts. And we came to the conclusion that this is really the master narrative of American identity. We retell these stories because we use them to define who we are ourselves in each generation, and every generation has to do that. So we have to invent new stories, and the template, if you will, that really lends itself to that kind of cultural work is the shipwreck and maroonage tale. So we had this idea that we can go back, every generation in American history tells these stories. And so I was originally going to write a book about 200 or about 400 years of American cultural history, where, talk about shipwreck in each of these instances. And Jamestown was the first chapter. And as I really got into the research, I discovered, my first chapter was going to be a 400-page book, because the story is just unbelievable. I mean, I hope you'll back me up on this after having read the book, that this true history is more fascinating and remarkable than any kind of fiction you could make up. It's just the things that happen in Jamestown, the coincidences, the rivalries. It's just such an incredibly rich story, those first 4 years of the colony, that you couldn't tell it in 30 pages, 40 pages.
No. So, and truth really is stranger than fiction. That's the one thing I have learned in this job.
Oh my God. Yes. Yeah. You've seen that I think in almost every podcast you do, probably. Right. So I kind of fell into it. I do think it's extraordinarily timely, and I'm sure that's, part of my attraction to this whole project, because I think we are at a moment right now too. I think it happens every generation or so. I mean, you can't use a timer to predict these things, but every 20, 30 years or so, the nation comes to a cultural crisis where things are in flux, and that particular generation redefines who we are as Americans, and I think that's going on right now. So I think this book is appearing at an important moment. It's triggered, of course, by everything everybody's familiar with, and no matter what side you're on in the political spectrum, there's no doubt that things are up for grabs right now. I mean, we're trying to redefine, or we're arguing about what it means to be an American citizen. You don't do that very often, but we're doing it right now. So we're at one of those cultural moments, I think, that it's pretty rare. Someone who lives to 80 years might see it happen twice or something.
What's great about your book is that it shows that there were other voices that were part of the making of America.
Yeah, and not only part of the making of America, I think these are the crucial voices that we have not been listening to. And if we listen to these voices, we're going to think very different. I mean, we're going to think differently about what's going on in the southern border right now than we might otherwise. Everybody disagrees on this, so I can't say everybody, but I think my hope would be your interpretation of what's happening in the southern border after reading my book would not really coincide with present government's point of view of what's going on in the southern border. I don't think it's an invasion. I don't think a military response is a proper response. I think if we look at the faces of the people who are trying to migrate to the United States, people who are walking or hitchhiking thousands of miles to get here, those faces are going to look, and what's in the hearts of those people are going to look very much like the characters who are in my book. Their skin might be a different color, a different tone, but in their hearts, those are people who have decided if they stay where they live right now, they may die, and they're taking their responsibility for their lives into their own hands. These are the heroic people. These are the people who are have the energy and the will and the wherewithal to actually try to do something rather than just staying in place and suffering. And that's really, I think, if you wanted to think about what is I keep saying I'm telling the Jamestown story differently, I'm turning it upside down and that kind of thing. But what that means is we have a group of people who are more or less hurled into the wilderness, and certainly what they consider a wilderness. I mean, that term itself is very, we could talk for a long time about that term, which I do, in the book. I talk about what that means. But from their point of view, they're hurled into a wilderness. In Jamestown, they're not literally marooned, although there is a literal maroonage tale in the heart of the book. They're not literally marooned, but they feel marooned because they are out in the wilderness and they're cut off from where they came from. There's no rescue that's available to them, right? And they look around and they see what their leaders are doing, and they realize that if they allow their leaders to continue leading, that's very likely they're going to die. So they have this choice: are we going to stick with the government that that we arrived with, and the governors that we arrived with, or are we going to take matters into our own hands? Are we going to have the courage to do that? And it takes a tremendous amount of courage and psychological courage to break with everything that you have known in the past and go off and start anew, tabula rasa, if you will, out in the wilderness. That's a very hard psychological move to make for anybody. It's scary, right? And it's the maroon experience or feeling marooned that emboldens people to do this, because going through the psychological experience of maroonage puts you in a position where it's a lot easier to go off into that wilderness, to abandon your leaders and go off and establish a new body politic yourself. This is where I think this is why I chose Marooned for the title of the book, even though literally, the first couple of waves of settlers in Jamestown are not literally marooned. It's the third wave that becomes literally marooned. But what happens in the maroon experience psychologically, and this is, I'm borrowing this from a fantastic literary critic named Steve Mentz, who has a book called Shipwrecked Modernity, which I learned an awful lot from. He read every single shipwreck tale, that was ever written about the Western Hemisphere, the Atlantic world, and even beyond the Atlantic world. And what he recognized was a three-part psychological pattern. So the first thing that happens is the shock of shipwreck, where you are metaphorically or sometimes literally slapped in the face with cold seawater. And if there's anything that's going to tell you things are not right and your world is topsy-turvy, it's going to be that, right? So there's the first part of this three-part psychological experience is that shock. Next comes immersion, where, again, literally or metaphorically, you are in the water. And, the solid ground of the ship's boards have disappeared from under your feet. The old world has disappeared. There's nothing holding you in suspension at all except for the seawater. You're not tethered to anything from the past. And you're watching other people float away, and you're watching the debris, the detritus of the old world get smashed on the rocks or sink under the sea. So you are absolutely alone and cut off from the rest of the world. And then after that immersion, then if you live, you're coughed up on the sandy shore, right? And you come up out of the surf, dripping that salt water, blinking at the sunshine after the storm has passed, looking up and down the beach to see who else has survived, what other debris, what other wreckage from the ship has come ashore. And that's the moment where you begin salvage. So what you've got to do is pick up the pieces, and you're going to pick up the pieces that are going to be useful to you in that wilderness. And you're going to ignore the other pieces. And this is literally true, of course. We know you're going to get what wood you can from the wreck. You're going to get what tools you can from the wreck, what foodstuffs that have survived their drenching in the seawater you're going to salvage from the wreck. So you're literally going to materially gather that salvage. But also you're going to do it politically. You're going to say, okay, we had certain structures that we came with, and they got smashed in the wreck that has stranded us here, right? Which of these tools are we going to pick up, and which of these tools are we going to ignore? I can give you an example of what I'm talking about. And we don't know the answer to this question, but I'm fascinated by this question. So there are two of the women who, I haven't even begun to tell the story of the shipwreck yet. Maybe I should tell that, and then I can get to this the center of the book, or you want to hold off a little bit?
Let's hold on to that. I want to talk a little bit about Jamestown before we get into that. Yeah. Before we get into the shipwreck. Okay. Tell us a little bit about how Maroons actually influenced Jamestown settlement in the creation of it.
Probably just about all of your listeners, when they hear the word maroon, what comes into their mind is this notion of shipwreck, where you're cast away on a desert island and you're marooned there, right? It's the Pirates of the Caribbean. You get marooned, one pirate and one woman and a bottle of rum or whatever it is, and you got to figure things out. But that originally was a metaphoric usage of the term. The term originally was coined by Spanish settlers in Hispaniola to talk. It denoted the cattle that they had brought from Spain, and they put in plantations in Hispaniola, and some of that cattle escaped out into the wilderness and became wild again. They were no longer domesticated, and the word they used was a cimarron for that cattle. Very quickly, that usage transferred to Africans who had been imported to Hispaniola and other Spanish possessions in the New World to be slaves. And when they escaped out into the wilderness, they were called cimarrons, just like that cattle. So the term originally was, the most important meaning of the term before this metaphoric meaning that we all understand right now, referred to escaped slaves. And everywhere Spain had colonies in the New World, there were Maroons. Some people would be able to escape the plantations, escape the mines, escape whatever tasks that they were given by their Spanish masters, and flee into the least accessible parts of the wilderness, whether that's mountains or whether that's swamps, wherever it would be very difficult to follow them. They would go in there. And in some cases, in what's called grand marronage today, they would actually set up communities, and some of these were huge, in the thousands. And so Sir Francis Drake comes into this because in the 1570s, he's pirating off the coast of Panama. What he wants to do is already what Spain has established in Panama is a port on the Caribbean side and a port on the Pacific side, and they all the silver that they're taking out of Peru they bring to the Pacific side, and they take caravans across the isthmus to the Caribbean side, load them on ships, and sail off to Spain. So what he wants to do is raid those ships, try to steal from this treasure train, if you will. And so he's cruising up and down the coast of Panama, and he has some successes, but a lot of failures. And his crew is getting disgruntled and that kind of thing. People are dying of disease. It's not going so well. But in the hinterland of Panama, up in the mountains, one of these maroon communities, which numbers in the thousands, when they hear wind of Sir Francis Drake, or he's not Sir Francis Drake yet, he's just plain old Francis Drake. They hear about what he's doing, and they send an embassy down to the coast to meet him. And it's, of course, it's kind of hard to find him, but he's got a little pirate fort that he's building on an island, and they come and they meet him, and they tell him who they are, and they say they can help him. And he ends up taking a couple dozen of his own pirates with him, with a caravan of Maroons, and he goes into the wilderness, and he marches for days, And they come, he comes to a marooned village and he sees them and he meets their leaders. And eventually, this is a moment like John Keats is on first reading Chapman's Homer, when stout Cortez looks out with eagle eyes in the Pacific. He comes up to to a ridge, and the maroon chief says, "Here, climb up this tree." And they've got kind of a ladder set up, and there's a gigantic platform up in this tree, a tree house really. And he goes up there, and he looks out to the west, and he sees the Pacific Ocean for the first time. And that's the moment Drake says, "I'm going there." So that's what plants a seed in his mind for his great circumnavigation of the globe. But for our purposes, what's really important is that these Maroons then help him actually raid the Spanish treasure train, and Drake gets the silver. They don't even want it. The Maroons don't want the silver because it's useless to them. They want iron, and so Drake gives them iron, which is much less valuable to him, and he takes the silver and sails back to England and tells everybody about this wonderful Maroon community. So this is of course before England has gotten into the empire game at all, and it's also at the time England is imagining itself as the champions of liberty against the tyrannical Catholic nations of the world, which of course are most represented by Spain, which is by far the most powerful country in Europe. So England is imagining itself as the champion of liberty and the leader in this fight against the dark forces. It's almost like people who remember the Cold War, the way we in the United States imagined ourselves in comparison to the totalitarian regime of communism. That's how the English are thinking of themselves in relationship to Spain. And they get this idea that they could almost with one stroke topple the Spanish Empire in the New World if they could harness the manpower and the energy and the love of liberty of these Maroons. So they concoct a scheme where Sir Francis Drake, by this time he has been knighted, is going to come back to the Caribbean with a gigantic fleet and thousands of soldiers. But even this big fleet and thousands of soldiers is not going to be enough to topple Spain and Cartagena and Jamaica and Cuba and Hispaniola and Panama. It's just too big. But what they're going to do is they're going to do basically like pirate raids on these cities, and they're going to liberate the slaves. And by liberating the slaves and persuading them to be loyal to England as their liberator, to Queen Elizabeth as this bastion of liberty, they'll be able to overcome the entire Spanish Empire almost at a stroke. And this is actually what is underpinning the colony in Roanoke. Roanoke is really the purpose of Roanoke is almost like it's going to be a pirate raiding station. And so England, so Sir Walter Raleigh sends a couple ships to Roanoke to set up that colony. Meanwhile, Sir Francis Drake sails this flotilla, this gigantic fleet, down to the Spanish possessions. It doesn't work. It doesn't. Lots of things go wrong. Some things go right. I mean, they raid a lot of cities and they liberate slaves. But the linchpin was going to be these Maroons down in Panama. And by the time Sir Francis Drake is ready to sail down to Panama, those Maroons have actually transacted a treaty with the Spanish authorities in Panama. So he realizes he's not going to be able to get them to go to war against Spain. But what's remarkable in this story is that he's got hundreds of liberated slaves on his ships. And at the end of his raids, he does like this circuit, from the eastern down south and up to the western part of the Caribbean, where he finishes his raids in Spanish Florida. And he comes up the coast and he comes to Roanoke. And what he finds in Roanoke is a disaster there, and he's rescuing them. Essentially, the entire colony, except for a couple people, get on his ships and abandon the Roanoke colony. But he leaves hundreds of liberated slaves, literal Maroons, people who have escaped slavery. And they disappear from history. They melt into the continent, and nobody really knows what happened to them. In my mind, that's really, talk about a Howard Zinn moment. I mean, this is really, when we think about the mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke, this is the real mystery. What happened to those people?
Do you think that they were Marooners themselves, like going back, because they were probably hungry, similar to Jamestown, that they were probably Marooners themselves and they absorbed into, the indigenous tribes?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what they did. I think if they had gone into, of course, this entire territory is all, dominated by Native Americans. And there's no like virgin territory you could go in like they did in Panama, go into the interior of the mountains and basically an unoccupied land. They didn't have unoccupied land along the eastern seaboard. So I'm pretty sure that's what they did. And that's what the few historians who actually even care to ask the question answer it that way. And I think that's the most plausible thing, which by the way, is also the most plausible answer to what happened to the lost white colony of Roanoke, in the late 1580s. Probably the exact same thing. A couple got killed probably in some skirmishes. Others got absorbed into the Native American districts.
So tell us how
so that's the original. Yeah,
I was going to say. So tell us how the Marooners actually got, like how that turned into the inspiration for Jamestown. Like where did Jamestown come into this?
Well, the Virginia Company is so Roanoke fails in the late 1580s, and the real reason it fails is because the Spanish Armada intervenes, and Spain has to present all of its energy and all of its shipping in a defense of the homeland. So Roanoke cannot be resupplied, and it takes years. And by the time they get back to Roanoke, the colony has disappeared. So that's a failure. And England doesn't have any foothold at all in North America or over the Atlantic Ocean. And so about a generation later, they decide to get back into it. So it's 1605, 1606. They start talking about trying to establish a new colony. And this one, some of the people who are forming the company to do this, the Virginia Company, first they have to go to Sir Walter Raleigh and get him to relinquish his patent on colonizing this territory, which he does. And the Virginia Company forms a bunch of merchants, bunch of political, well-appointed, politicos, some, what we would call professors are involved. One in particular, Richard Hakluyt, the great cosmographer, is on the original charter. And they establish a joint stock company after the fashion of like the Muscovy Company and the East India Company, except the difference in the Virginia Company, those joint stock companies is what enabled England to start establishing a trade empire, because the risk was so great in trying to trade with Turkey, for instance, that no individual could undertake such a thing, because if you lost a ship, you went bankrupt, right? So they pooled their resources together, and that's what a joint stock company is. Everybody shares the risk and they share the profits. And by joining together, they're able to raise capital that's needed to, provide ships with armament and essentially, even pay the salaries of ambassadors to these places. England's first ambassadors to these exotic places like Moscow were actually paid, on the payroll of one of these companies. So the Virginia Company is established as a joint stock company like those, but the big difference is that you can invest in the company not only with money, but you can invest in the company with your body as well. So we get a bunch of gentlemen who go on, most of them who are kind of down on their luck, and they're trying to revive their family fortune by doing this. And they generally buy at least a couple shares in the company at £12, 10 shillings, which is a pretty, it's a bigger sum than any commoner can put together. But it's for somebody down on, even a gentleman is going to be able to put together that kind of money. So they buy shares, but they also, those gentlemen, by getting on the ships that are going to go to Jamestown, their body gives them a share as well. And it's the same thing with the commoners. The commoners themselves, by virtue of getting on the ships, earn a share. They're given a share in the company. They didn't buy it, but the very fact that they're going on the ship gives them a share. So they're shareholders as well. So they're going to Jamestown. with the sense in their minds that they have entered into a contract, and which they literally have. They have taken an oath to abide by the king's laws and abide by the governance of the company. And in return, after a period of years, they're going to be given land, and the company's going to be broken up, and whatever profits, they'll get their share in the profits of the company, et cetera. So the whole enterprise is a contract. And when they get to Jamestown, what happens to them is they feel the original, almost from the very beginning, things start going wrong. They arrive in April. They start establishing Jamestown in this ill-advised, swampy island that has got no real good fresh water on it. It's defensible because it's kind of a peninsula, so you can just defend this one point to keep people from invading it. But for every other reason, it's kind of a difficult. It's not a great place. So they arrive, in late spring, early summer, start building their palisade and establishing their colony. But by August, September, they are dying. They're going through what was later called the seasoning that people go through, semi-tropical diseases here in the New World. Right? So, and not only that, but the president of the colony gets deposed by other council members, and there's almost basically a civil war going on among the councilors. So these people who have bought a share in the company with their own body, that's the only way they afford it, and entered into this contract with the Virginia company. They're looking around at what's going on, and they're realizing if they stick with this contract, they're probably going to die. By the time we get to September, pretty much half the people have disappeared. They've either died and been buried, not from starvation, but from diseases that are exacerbated by malnutrition, and or a couple of them are killed by skirmishes with the Native Americans. But many of them, and we don't know how many, but we do know a lot of them have disappeared because they have defected to the Indians. And as a matter of fact, in the first fall, there is a miraculous, what seems to the destitute survivors within the palisade of Jamestown. They're trying to hide their graves. They're burying everybody inside the palisade to make sure the Indians don't see how weak they are. So they know that they could get overwhelmed by the Indians very easily. But lo and behold, one day the Indians show up at the gate carrying food, and it saves the colony. And to them, it just seems miraculous that God worked through these devil worshippers to bring them sustenance. When in fact, probably what happened is some of those people who defected to the Indians persuaded them to help their fellows back in the fort. So right from the very beginning, the very first 6 months in Jamestown, we have people escaping the colony because the conditions that they are suffering there, to them, is akin to, I wouldn't say at this stage yet, it's akin to slavery. It will get to that point. But at this point, it's what it really is more like a military garrison. They're treated like foot soldiers. And that's not what they signed on for. That was not in the contract, that they were going to become garrison soldiers in this far-flung fort, but that's what they're suffering. For example, you need a passport to go outside of the gates, that kind of thing. They had never bargained for that kind of limitation on their liberty of movement and things like that. So even from the very beginning, I would describe these people as Maroons in that old sense of the word. These are people who are escaping forced labor conditions that it was not written up in the contract, or certainly not the contract as they understood it, that they engaged in this enterprise, that persuaded them to go along, to go to Virginia. So they are escapees, and they know if they get caught, they can be treated the way those Maroons were treated in Spanish Panama, in Spanish Hispaniola. And I've said a couple times that these people were really brave. They were, because if a Maroon gets caught, if you get caught, generally what happens is you are very publicly maimed or killed in order to terrorize everybody else from doing the same thing that you did. That's what happened in Spanish Florida. You read the accounts of what happened to escaped slaves, and it is just unbelievable. It's gut-wrenching to read the kind of punishments even children suffered at the hands of the Spanish. So Maroons knew, this was a really dangerous thing to do, but you got to the point where you just had to secure your own freedom, your own liberty, because you just can't take the indignity, or you're afraid you're going to die in the situation. You're just going to be worked to death in the mine or the plantation. So if you don't do it, things are going to be pretty darn miserable, if not leading to death. And that's exactly what's happening in Jamestown. So when I talk about the settlers in Jamestown being Maroons, to some degree, I'm talking by analogy. I mean, what they're doing in Jamestown is very similar to what we saw happening in Spanish possessions in the New World. Now, of course, that's going to become, I said it's by analogy. It's maybe a little bit of a metaphoric application in the first couple of years in Jamestown. By the time we get to the third resupply of the colony, which is, put together in spring of 1609 and sails in early summer in June 1609, to come and resupply Jamestown for the third time, what happens to that enterprise is literally maroonage in both senses, in the sense of being cast away and in the sense of people suffering the conditions of slavery and trying to escape it. That's the heart. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You were saying that's the heart. What were you going to say?
Yeah, that's the heart of the book. It takes me a while to get there, but it's a story of what happens to the people in the third supply of Jamestown in 1609 that I think is the richest part of the story for thinking about Jamestown as the real origin tale of American democracy, American history.
All right, well, let's hold it right there. Let's take a quick break, and we'll come back and we'll pick up the story of the sea venture to help resupply Jamestown. This is The Mind's Eye. We'll be right back with Professor Joseph Kelly.